Hey guys, tonight we are stepping back roughly 800 years, pulling on our thinnest wool stockings, and walking straight into a medieval winter that has absolutely no interest in your comfort, your survival, or your carefully laid plans. Forget the romanticized version you might have seen in films, the crackling great hall, the rosy-cheeked lords, the dramatic snow falling prettily outside a leaded window while someone plays a lute. That version is a lie your modern nervous system invented to cope. The reality of a medieval winter was rawer, darker, colder, and far more personal than any Hollywood set designer has ever managed to capture. Tonight, we are going to live it together slowly through every sensory detail we can summon, because that is the only honest way to understand what hundreds of millions of ordinary human beings endured for centuries just to make it to March. You probably won't survive this, by the way. Not the medieval version of you, anyway. Statistically speaking, if you were a peasant in 14th century England or a crofter in the Scottish Highlands or a farmer on the frost-hardened plains of northern France, your odds of seeing another summer depended on decisions made months earlier, on luck, on neighbors, on the thickness of your thatch, and on whether your cow made it through January. No pressure. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you want to join the little community gathering in the comments tonight, drop your location and your local time. There is something genuinely lovely about knowing that someone in Oslo and someone in Auckland and someone in a car park in Birmingham are all drifting off to the same story at the same moment. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are standing at the edge of a village. The year is somewhere in the long stretch of the High Middle Ages, let us say the early 13th century, because the historical record is rich enough there to be interesting and the climate has not yet turned into the catastrophe it will become 100 years later. The air arriving through your open doorway smells of turned earth and wood smoke and something faintly animal, which is not unpleasant once you get used to it, which you have because you have never known anything else. The leaves on the oak at the field's edge have gone the color of dried blood. The geese are restless. Your knees ache in a particular way. They only ache when the temperature is about to drop hard and stay there. This is how medieval winter arrives. Not with a single dramatic snowfall, not with a declared date on a calendar, but with a slow, insistent accumulation of signals that every person in your village has been reading since childhood. The quality of the morning light, the behavior of livestock, the thickness of the onion skins, and yes, people genuinely used onion skin thickness as a folk predictor of winter severity, and historians still argue whether this practice had any empirical basis or whether it was pure folk superstition passed down through generations of hopeful farmers. The point is that you were watching. You were always watching because the stakes of being caught unprepared were not inconvenient. They were fatal. The medieval calendar structured winter as a moral and spiritual season as much as a physical one. In the Christian framework that shaped every waking hour of your existence, winter was a time of inwardness, of penance, of waiting. The liturgical year moved through Advent into Christmas and then through the cold months toward the resurrection of Lent and Easter, and this rhythm was not separate from the agricultural rhythm, it was fused with it. You fasted when the food was running low anyway. You celebrated at midwinter when you needed the light and the warmth of community most desperately. The Church did not invent these impulses. It absorbed them from older traditions and gave them new names, and the result was a calendar that actually made a kind of psychological sense for people living in genuine darkness for 16 hours a day. Let us talk about that darkness because it is the thing modern people most consistently underestimate. You live in a world where darkness is optional. You can banish it with a switch. Even if your power goes out, you have a phone in your pocket that produces more light than a medieval great hall could manage on its best evening. In your village in the 13th century, you have tallow candles if you can afford the fat to make them, rushes dipped in grease if you cannot, and a central hearth fire if the wood supply holds. That is it. That is your entire arsenal against the dark. And in the depths of December in Northern Europe, darkness begins around 4 in the afternoon and does not lift until well past 7 in the morning. You are spending 15 hours in near total darkness every single day, for months, with nothing to do but sleep, talk in low voices, tend the fire and think. Historians have noted, with some fascination, that medieval sleep patterns appear to have been fundamentally different from modern ones precisely because of this darkness. The concept of a single, unbroken 8-hour sleep is, in a sense, a modern industrial invention. Medieval sources, personal letters, court records, medical texts, monastery chronicles, refer routinely to a first sleep and a second sleep, with a period of wakefulness in between, sometimes lasting an hour or two, during which people would pray, have quiet conversations, tend to the fire, or simply lie in the dark and let their thoughts move. This was not insomnia. This was the natural human sleep architecture that reasserts itself whenever artificial lighting is removed, and it is one of the most quietly revolutionary things you can learn about daily medieval life. You were not broken for waking at midnight. You were normal. You were, in fact, experiencing sleep the way every human being on Earth experienced it before gas lamps and electric bulbs arrived to flatten the night into a single undifferentiated stretch. But we are getting ahead of ourselves because it is not yet deep winter. It is that first moment of cold, that edge of autumn chill, and you are standing in your village watching the signals accumulate. The swallows left weeks ago. The pigs have been slaughtered, the great autumn pig killing that happened across Europe in November, timed to the moment when the cold was just reliable enough to help preserve the meat, was one of the most significant events of the agricultural year, and the smell of it, the salt and blood and rendered fat, still hangs faintly over the village. The last of the root vegetables have been pulled from the ground and carried to wherever you store them, which is a decision that requires more strategic thinking than you might expect and which we will get into properly in a later section. For now, what matters is the psychology of this moment, the psychology of watching winter come, because there is a particular quality of medieval anxiety in late October and early November that is unlike anything most of us in the modern world have experienced, and it is worth sitting with it for a moment. You have spent the entire year working toward this point. Everything, the planting, the tending, the harvesting, the preserving, has been aimed at accumulating enough resources to survive the next 4 to 5 months. You are about to find out if you succeeded. You do not get to go to the supermarket. You do not get to order something online. If the harvest was bad, if the grain got wet and moldy in the barn, if the cow died in September, if the neighbors with whom you share resources had their own disasters, then winter is not merely uncomfortable. Winter is a sentence. The anxiety was not abstract. It was physical, embodied, present in the body the way cold itself is present in the body. You feel it before you can name it. And yet, and this is the part that tends to get lost in modern retellings, it was also not the only thing you felt. There was a kind of readiness that came with it, a settling. The frantic pace of harvest season had passed. The fields were empty. The community was drawing inward, toward the hearth and the hall, toward the shared warmth that was both literal and social. Winter was a time of stories, of long evenings with neighbors, of the particular intimacy that comes from being crowded together against a common enemy. Your village, wherever it sits in this European landscape, is a small place. Perhaps 30 households, perhaps 50, depending on the region and the century. The physical geography of the settlement has been shaped partly by the needs of winter survival in ways that are easy to miss if you are just looking at a map. The houses cluster together, which is partly about community and partly about the windbreak that a cluster of buildings creates. The orientation of doorways tends to avoid the prevailing cold wind direction. The church, almost always the most substantial stone structure in the village, provides not just spiritual but literal shelter. A place where the community can gather if the cold becomes truly dangerous, where the thick walls hold residual warmth, where the candles and bodies of worshippers create a microclimate noticeably warmer than the world outside. You are a mainstream historical fact walking around in rough wool. The average medieval peasant in Northern Europe consumes somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 calories per day during the working season. But the nutritional reality of winter meant that caloric intake dropped significantly precisely when the body needed more fuel to stay warm. This contradiction, needing more energy in the cold, having less food available in the cold, sits at the heart of medieval winter survival and shapes almost every decision you will make over the next 4 months. The cold itself is not a single thing. Medieval people in northern France or England were dealing with a climate that, during the High Middle Ages, was actually slightly warmer than what came later. The medieval warm period had made agriculture possible at higher altitudes and latitudes than had been the case before. But warmer is relative. January in a one-room stone cottage or timber-framed wattle and daub house, with no insulation in the modern sense, with wind finding every gap in every wall, with a fire that must be rationed because the wood supply is finite, was still genuinely, lethally cold. Temperatures inside medieval homes could drop to just a few degrees above freezing on particularly brutal nights, especially toward the end of winter when the fuel supply was running low. And here is a small, slightly absurd fact that tends to delight people. The coldest you would ever feel in your entire medieval life was almost certainly the moment you got out of bed in the morning. Not outside in the snow, not walking across the frozen fields, but that specific domestic horror of emerging from beneath your pile of blankets and animal skins into the frigid air of a room where the fire had burned low overnight. Medieval mornings were an act of will. Every single one of them. The fact that hundreds of millions of people performed this act of will, in darkness, in cold, day after day, season after season, for their entire lives, is one of the quiet heroisms of human history that nobody writes epic poems about but probably should. The sun is lower now. The light has that thin, pale quality that means nothing will warm up today no matter how bright it gets. You pull your outer layer tighter and look at the woodpile. You are always looking at the woodpile. The woodpile is not just fuel. It is time. It is the physical embodiment of how many more cold days you can survive, standing there beside the house, and you have become the kind of person who calculates its dimensions in your sleep, because it is that important. Because everything about your winter comes down to questions of resource and duration and whether what you have will last as long as the cold does. The cold is coming. It is already here, in fact, in the way your breath fogs in the morning air and in the particular silence that settles over the village on still, freezing nights. A silence so complete and so deep that it almost has a texture. You stand in it for a moment because there is something in it that is not entirely terrible. Something ancient and quiet and, in its way, beautiful. Then you go back inside because you are not an idiot, and inside is where the fire is, and the fire is everything, and how medieval people managed that fire, and their homes and their bodies and their communities is the whole rest of the story. The house you are returning to is not the house your imagination probably built for you. Forget the drafty stone castle for a moment. That is someone else's problem, someone with a title and a set of political anxieties you do not have time for. Your house is smaller, more immediate, and in its own way more ingeniously designed than it gets credit for. It is a structure that has been refined over generations of trial and error, shaped by the specific climate of your region, the available building materials within a day's travel, and the accumulated wisdom of every ancestor who froze to death in a worse version of it. You are, in a sense, living inside the solution to a very long engineering problem, and the problem was simply this: how do you keep a human body warm enough to survive in a northern European winter using only what the land immediately around you can provide? The answer, across most of medieval Europe, was a building type historians call the longhouse, though regional variations wore different names and took different forms. In its most common incarnation, this was a single long rectangular structure divided roughly into two sections. One end for the human inhabitants, one end for the livestock. This arrangement strikes most modern people as either charming or appalling depending on their relationship with animals, but it was neither, it was engineering. A cow generates an enormous amount of body heat. Several cows, a few pigs, some goats, a huddle of sheep, these animals collectively produce warmth equivalent to a substantial heating system, and that warmth drifts through whatever partition separated the animal end from the human end and raises the ambient temperature of the whole structure by several degrees. Several degrees in a medieval winter is not a trivial thing. Several degrees is the difference between sleeping and not sleeping, between functioning and suffering, between making it to spring and not quite managing it. The partition between the human and animal sections was often not a solid wall. It might be a wattle screen, a hanging of heavy cloth, a low wooden barrier. Enough to keep the animals from wandering into your sleeping area during the night, not enough to block the thermal benefits of their presence. The smell, which you are presumably wondering about, was simply the smell of your house. You had grown up with it. It was as neutral to you as the smell of your own kitchen is to you now, which is to say completely unnoticeable until someone from outside comes in and makes a face, at which point you feel faintly defensive about it. Medieval people had guests who reacted to the smell of their homes. We know this from satirical literature and travelers' accounts. The hosts apparently never quite understood what the fuss was about. The walls of your house were doing more work than they looked like they were doing. In the timber frame tradition of England and northern France, the frame was filled with wattle and daub, a lattice of woven branches plastered over with a mixture of clay, soil, animal dung, and straw. This mixture, when properly applied and dried, created a wall that was genuinely decent at thermal retention by medieval standards. It was not modern insulation, but it was not nothing. The dung in the mixture was not incidental. Animal dung contains fibrous organic material that adds structural integrity to the daub and, importantly, reduces cracking as the wall expands and contracts through temperature changes. Medieval builders knew this empirically, through generations of observation, without having any theoretical framework for why it worked. They just knew that walls made with dung cracked less, and cracked less meant drafty less, and drafty less meant warmer inside. The roof was, in many ways, the most important thermal component of the whole structure. Thatch, cut reed or straw laid in thick overlapping layers, is a genuinely excellent insulating material. A well-laid thatch roof several feet thick creates a thermal barrier that keeps heat in during winter and keeps the interior cool during summer, and it does this through the same principle as modern loft insulation: trapped air. The thousands of tiny air pockets between the individual stalks or reeds resist the movement of heat in either direction. A good thatch could last 20 to 40 years if maintained, and maintaining it was a constant preoccupation. A damaged patch meant a draft, meant damp, meant cold air finding its way in exactly where you did not want it. Historians still argue whether the medieval peasantry had a systematic understanding of weatherproofing as a concept or whether their maintenance practices were purely reactive, fixing problems as they appeared rather than preventing them through regular scheduled upkeep. The evidence suggests something in between. There are references in estate management records to annual thatching work as a standard obligation of tenants, which implies a calendrical approach to roof maintenance. But individual households clearly varied enormously in how conscientiously this was done, and the correlation between a well-maintained roof and household survival outcomes in hard winters was probably not lost on anyone paying attention. The floor was almost certainly beaten earth in most peasant homes, which sounds grim but functioned reasonably well when covered with rushes or straw. Fresh rushes were laid periodically, and the layer of old rushes beneath trapped some warmth and provided a degree of insulation between your feet and the cold ground. Great halls in wealthier establishments used herbs mixed into the rushes: lavender, meadowsweet, fleabane, both for scent and for the flea-repelling properties of certain plants, because fleas were a constant companion of medieval winter life, sharing your warmth whether you invited them or not. This is one of those quirky historical details that sounds like a footnote but was actually a daily reality. You were never truly alone in your warm house. The warmth you generated attracted a whole ecosystem of small passengers who found your body and your bedding and your floor rushes as hospitable as you found your hearth. Windows were small, few, and covered in winter with wooden shutters, oiled cloth, or, in wealthier households, thin sheets of horn scraped to translucency, which let in a diffuse, dreamlike light while blocking the wind. Glass was expensive enough that its presence in a window was a statement of serious wealth, and even then it appeared in small panes held together with lead strips rather than the large transparent expanses we associate with windows today. The consequence of this for interior winter life was significant. Your house was genuinely dark during the day. Not as dark as at night, but dim enough that detailed work. Sewing, reading if you were literate, any kind of craft that required close focus, was done close to the window or close to the fire, and often both at once, huddled at the intersection of the two available light sources with your work held up to catch whatever was available. The door was a point of serious thermal anxiety. It was, by necessity, the main gap in your thermal envelope, and every time it opened, cold air poured in at floor level while warm air escaped above. Wealthier homes began to develop the porch or screens passage, an enclosed entryway that created a buffer zone between the outside and the main living space so that when you came in from the cold, you entered an intermediate space first, closed the outer door, and only then opened the inner door. This airlock principle, independently invented by cultures across the cold world from the Norse to the Inuit, is so obviously sensible that it eventually became standard in Northern European domestic architecture. In your simpler home, the equivalent might be a heavy hanging of cloth just inside the door, which caught the worst of the draft and fell back into place after you entered, performing the same function with considerably less carpentry. The central hearth, a flat stone or clay platform in the middle of the main room, or set slightly off-center to allow smoke to rise toward a hole or louved vent in the roof, was the thermal and social core of the house. We will spend considerable time with the fire itself in a later section, but the physical relationship between the hearth and the rest of the house is worth noting here. The medieval house was designed around the fire the way a modern house is designed around the kitchen. It was the room. Everything else in the space oriented itself in relation to the hearth. Sleeping areas were arranged to catch the heat. Work was done as close to it as compatible with the task. The animals at the far end were near enough to benefit from it, but not so near as to cause problems. The whole spatial logic of the medieval interior was thermal logic. Beds, in this context, were pieces of thermal engineering as much as furniture. The wealthy had elaborate wooden bedsteads with canopies and curtains that created, in effect, a small room within a room. A personal microclimate that retained body heat through the night and blocked drafts from every direction. The curtains of a great medieval bed were not decorative. They were insulation. They were your private weather system. You pulled them closed, for bodies climbed in together if the family was large and the bed was big, and the temperature inside those curtains climbed to something genuinely comfortable within a few minutes of settling down. People slept with servants in the same bed, with children piled in, with the warmth of other bodies treated as a straightforward resource to be shared rather than a privacy issue. Historians still find this aspect of medieval sleeping arrangements mildly shocking to explain to modern audiences, and yet it was simply practical. A single body in a cold room loses heat faster than a pile of bodies in a curtained bed, and everyone knew it. Poorer households had simpler arrangements: a straw-filled mattress on a raised wooden platform to keep it off the cold floor, piled with every blanket and animal skin the household possessed. The skins of slaughtered animals, sheep, goat, rabbit, dog in desperate times, were cured and used as bedding, and the particular warmth of a deep pile of animal skins is something that modern synthetic sleeping bags approximate but do not quite replicate. There is a density to real fur, a weight of it, that presses warmth back into the body in a way that feels almost deliberate. Medieval people sleeping under piles of sheepskin were not living in privation by their own standards. They were using the best available technology for the job. The house also stored things, which affected its interior climate in ways both helpful and problematic. Grain stored inside or adjacent to the living space added some thermal mass. A large pile of grain does not change temperature quickly, and in a cold spell, the stored warmth of the harvest was literal as well as metaphorical. Dried herbs, preserved foods, tools, extra clothing, all of it hung from rafters or stacked against walls, creating a kind of layered, inhabited density that made the interior feel close and warm in a way that an empty room never could. The clutter of a medieval winter interior was functional clutter. Every hanging onion braid, every bundle of dried thyme, every coil of spare rope was also slightly warmer than the air outside, contributing its tiny fraction to the aggregate heat of the space. One genuinely quirky piece of this picture involves the walls themselves accumulating what we might call biological insulation over time. The combination of smoke, grease, human and animal breath condensing on surfaces, and the general biological richness of a medieval interior meant that walls and rafters developed a coating of organic material over years of habitation. This coating, while not something anyone designed intentionally, actually increased the thermal resistance of the walls slightly and contributed to the distinctive smell of a long-inhabited medieval building. A smell that contemporary visitors frequently described as powerful, complex, and entirely unlike anything outside. Whether this constituted a meaningful thermal benefit or was simply a side effect of living in close quarters with animals and fire for decades, nobody has yet managed to measure with any precision, and it remains one of those small mysteries at the edge of material history. Outside your walls, the village itself was arranged to create windbreaks and shared shelter. Garden walls, hedgerows, the bodies of outbuildings. All of these interrupted the movement of cold air through the settlement and created pockets of relative calm where the wind chill was reduced. The siting of villages in valleys, in the lee of hills, at the edges of forests, was not purely about access to water or agricultural land. It was also about wind. Medieval village planners, insofar as villages were planned rather than simply grown, understood intuitively that a village sheltered from the prevailing wind was a village where people were less likely to freeze, and the landscape of rural Europe still bears the marks of those decisions. In the position of church towers and the curve of old lanes and the way ancient settlements nestle into the land as if the land itself is trying to hold them. You are back inside now. The door is shut. The draft cloth has settled back into place. The fire is where the fire always is, and its light is doing what firelight always does, filling the space with a warmth that is as much psychological as thermal, casting the familiar shapes of your possessions in amber and shadow, making the world outside seem very far away. Your house is not comfortable by any standard you carry forward from the 21st century, but it is working. It is doing what it was built to do. And the people who built it, and the people who lived in it before you, and the people who will live in it after you all understood something about the relationship between a body and a building that we have largely outsourced to thermostats and forgotten. That warmth is not a given. It is an achievement. It is something you build, and maintain, and share, and defend every single day of a medieval winter, with everything you have. The house is holding its warmth, the thatch is doing its job, and the animals at the far end are breathing their slow, bovine contributions to the ambient temperature of your world. But none of that matters. Not the clever daub walls, not the curtain bed, not the draft cloth over the door, if the shelves are empty. Because the most sophisticated thermal engineering in medieval Europe could not keep a starving body warm, and starvation was not a distant theoretical risk for the medieval peasantry. It was a recurring, documented, historically verified reality that visited communities across Northern Europe with a regularity that should make us deeply uncomfortable about how casually we tend to romanticize the period. The house was the vessel, the food was the fuel, and the story of how medieval people actually accumulated, preserved, and rationed that fuel across the killing months of winter is one of the most logistically impressive and quietly desperate stories in all of human history. It begins in summer, which is when winter survival actually starts. This is the great temporal trick of the agricultural year that modern life has largely erased from our instincts. The idea that you are always working 2 seasons ahead, that the food on your table in February was decided by decisions made in May, that the margin between survival and catastrophe is built or destroyed in the long bright days when catastrophe seems furthest away. Medieval farmers understood this with a clarity born of necessity. Every decision about what to plant, how much to plant, where to plant it, when to harvest it, how to store it, all of it was made in the shadow of the coming winter, even on the warmest July afternoon. The primary caloric staple across most of medieval northern Europe was grain, rye, barley, oats, and wheat, in roughly descending order of affordability and ascending order of desirability. Wheat was the prestige grain, the one that made white bread, the bread that appeared on the tables of the wealthy and in the offerings of the church. Rye was the grain of the ordinary people, dense and dark and slightly sour, baked into loaves that lasted longer than wheat bread and provided more sustained energy, which was, when you think about it, exactly what you needed. Barley went into pottage and ale. Oats, particularly in Scotland and the northern uplands, were the grain that would grow when nothing else would, the stubborn last resort of thin soils and short growing seasons, and oat pottage kept entire populations alive through winters that would have broken a more wheat-dependent culture. The harvest of these grains, which happened across August and September depending on the crop and the climate, was the single most important collective labor event of the medieval year. Every able-bodied person worked. The elderly, the children, the sick who could stand, everyone participated in some capacity, because the window of time between a grain crop being ready and a grain crop being ruined by rain or early frost was sometimes measured in days. You cut with sickles and scythes, you bound the cut grain into sheaves, you stood the sheaves and stooks in the field to dry, you watched the sky with the particular anxiety of someone whose entire winter depends on the weather holding for another week. Historians note that medieval harvest anxiety was so pervasive that it generated its own liturgical response. The rogation days, the blessing of the fields, the harvest festivals that Christianity absorbed from older traditions, all of it channeling genuine, visceral fear into ritual form because fear needed somewhere to go. Once the grain was cut and dried, it needed to be stored somewhere that was dry, ventilated, and reasonably secure against the 3 great enemies of stored grain: moisture, rodents, and theft. The granary, where a separate structure existed, was often elevated on stone or wooden staddle stones, those mushroom-shaped supports you still see at Old English farmsteads, because a raised floor meant rats and mice could not easily reach the grain from below, and the airflow beneath the floor helped keep moisture from wicking up through the base. The Stattle stone granary is one of those medieval solutions so elegant and effective that it simply continued to be used for centuries beyond the Middle Ages, a piece of vernacular engineering that solved its problem so completely that nobody felt any pressing need to improve it. But grain, even perfectly stored, would only take you so far. The medieval winter diet required protein and fat in quantities that grain alone could not supply, and this is where the Great Autumn Slaughter entered the picture, that November pig killing we touched on earlier, which was only the most dramatic element of a broader autumn culling of livestock that shaped the entire resource landscape of the winter months. The timing of animal slaughter was one of the most complex decisions a medieval farming household made. Every animal you kept through winter needed to be fed from your stored hay and grain reserves. Every animal you slaughtered in autumn was meat that could be preserved for winter consumption but was also a working animal, a breeding animal, a future resource that you were consuming in advance. The calculus was brutal and specific. You kept breeding pairs. You kept your best milking cow if you could possibly afford to feed her, because a cow producing milk through winter, and some breeds could be kept in milk through careful management, was worth almost any amount of hay. You kept your draft animals because without them, next spring's plowing was impossible. Everything else, the older animals, the surplus males, the animals that had shown weakness in the autumn, those went to the knife in November, when the cold was just arriving and would help preserve the meat during processing. And the village was briefly rich with blood and fat and the communal work of butchering, which was shared because the equipment, the skills, and frankly the sheer volume of work required made it a collective enterprise. The preservation techniques applied to this meat were limited but effective within their limitations. Salt was the most important preservative in the medieval world, and access to salt was not trivial. It was a traded commodity, sometimes taxed, always valuable, stored and rationed with the same care as grain. Meat packed in salt in wooden barrels or ceramic crocks would last through winter, though by February it had become intensely salty and somewhat leathery in texture, requiring soaking in water before cooking to make it palatable. Smoking was the other primary technique, applied to hams and bacon over slow burning with fires that added flavor while reducing moisture content and creating a surface hostile to bacterial growth. A well-smoked ham hanging from the rafters of a medieval cottage was not just food. It was security. It was the visible, tangible evidence that you had done your autumn work correctly and that the worst of winter would not find you without protein. Fish played a significant role in the medieval winter diet, particularly given the religious requirement to abstain from meat on Fridays, during Advent, and during Lent, which collectively amounted to a substantial portion of the winter calendar. The genius solution to the problem of supplying fish to inland populations who were days of travel from any coast was dried and salted fish, particularly stockfish, cod that had been split, salted, and dried to a hard, nearly indestructible plank that could be transported hundreds of miles and stored for months or years. Soaked in water and then cooked, stockfish reconstituted into something that was nutritious if not exciting, and it was consumed in quantities that would astonish the modern diner. The herring trade, which moved vast quantities of salt herring from the North Sea ports of the Baltic to towns and villages across northern Europe, was one of the defining commercial enterprises of the medieval period, and the humble salted herring kept more people alive through more medieval winters than any other single food item. Dairy products occupied a complicated position in the winter food supply. Fresh milk was scarce in winter because cows not specifically managed for year-round milk production dried up in the cold months, and many households had already slaughtered their dairy animals in the autumn culling. The solution was the transformation of summer's dairy abundance into forms that would survive the winter, hard cheeses, which developed rinds that protected the interior for months, butter packed into barrels and sometimes buried in peat bogs where the cold and acidity preserved it remarkably well, whey-based products that stretched every drop of milk into a caloric form. Bog butter, ancient butter discovered by peat cutters across Ireland, Scotland, and Scandinavia, sometimes hundreds or even thousands of years old, is one of the quirkier artifacts of this preservation tradition, and while most examples predate the medieval period, the practice of burying dairy in peat continued in some areas well into medieval times. Historians still argue whether bog burial was primarily a preservation strategy or had religious or ritual dimensions as well, And the answer is probably that the distinction between practical and sacred was far less clear in the medieval mind than we tend to assume. Vegetables and legumes completed the picture. Peas, beans, and lentils dried in their pods and stored in sacks provided the slow-burning plant protein that, combined with grain, gave the medieval peasant diet its sustaining quality. Root vegetables, turnips, parsnips, and the tough, starchy varieties of the time, nothing like the sweet, carefully bred versions in your supermarket, were stored in root cellars dug into the earth, where the ground temperature stayed just above freezing through even the hardest winters, preserving the vegetables without freezing them. The root cellar is another piece of low-technology engineering so effective that it required no significant improvement for centuries. The earth itself as refrigerator, maintaining the precise temperature range needed to slow decay without causing frost damage. Apples and pears, where orchards existed, were stored in cool outbuildings, checked regularly for rot, and eaten in order of ripeness. The ones showing the first signs of softening consumed first, the harder varieties kept for later. A medieval person managing a stored apple supply had internalized a continuous triage process, a constant evaluation of which fruit needed to be eaten today and which could wait another week, that kept nothing from going to waste if it could possibly be avoided, because waste was not an abstract environmental concern in the medieval world. Waste was hunger. Waste was cold. Waste was a specific embodied consequence that you would experience in your own body in February, and you knew it in October, and so you were careful in a way that we, with our full refrigerators and composting bins, have largely lost the instinct for. The quantities involved were staggering to calculate and yet never quite felt sufficient. A single person needed roughly enough grain to produce approximately 1.5 pounds of bread or pottage ingredients per day. Multiply that by the number of people in your household, add the feed requirements for the animals you were keeping through winter, factor in the inevitable losses to moisture, rodent damage, and the occasional catastrophic spoilage event, and the amount of grain that needed to come out of the harvest and into storage was enormous relative to the storage capacity of a small peasant household. Estate records from medieval England suggest that a bare survival winter required reserves equivalent to roughly half of the entire grain yield, and in bad harvest years, when the yield itself was depressed, that fraction was simply not available. The psychological dimension of this arithmetic cannot be overstated. You knew, going into winter, roughly how long your food would last. You could look at your grain store and your salt meat barrel and your dried peas and make a calculation, not precise, not scientific, but informed by experience, of whether what you had would get you to the next harvest. And that calculation was something you carried in your body all winter, reassessing it every time you drew from the stores, every time an unexpected guest needed feeding, every time a family member fell ill and needed better food than the household was currently rationing itself to. The anxiety of the store was the background radiation of medieval winter life, low-level and constant, occasionally spiking into genuine crisis, never entirely absent. And yet, and this is the thing that keeps surprising researchers who study medieval nutrition, people managed. Not always, not everyone, not in every winter. The historical record is full of famine events, of communities that did not make it, of the terrible springs when the grain ran out before the first green things pushed through the soil. But in ordinary years, in most communities, across most of the medieval period, the combination of diversified food sources, community sharing, careful preservation, and what we might call nutritional ingenuity, the ability to extract caloric value from things that a modern palate would reject, kept the majority of people alive. They arrived at spring thinner than they had entered winter, with a specific kind of hunger that was partly physical and partly the accumulated memory of months of careful restraint. But they arrived. You have arrived at spring thinner and hungrier, at least in the imagination of this telling, but we are getting ahead of ourselves again because it is still the deep heart of winter and the most important object in your world. More important than your food stores, more important than your bed, more important than the house itself is the fire. The fire is not a feature of your winter. The fire is your winter. It is the axis around which every hour of the dark season turns, the thing you tend before you tend anything else in the morning and the last thing you check before you allow yourself to sleep, and the relationship a medieval person had with their hearth fire was as intimate, as anxious, and as constant as any relationship they had with another human being. Possibly more so because the fire, unlike a spouse or a neighbor, could not be relied upon to look after itself. Let us begin with the most fundamental fact about medieval fire management. which is one that most people find quietly astonishing when they first encounter it. In many medieval households, the fire was never allowed to go out. Not for days, not for weeks, sometimes not for the entire winter season. This was not laziness or inattention. It was deliberate policy, because relighting a fire from cold was a significantly more difficult and time-consuming operation than keeping an existing fire alive. And in a world where every unit of warmth was precious and the consequences of a cold house were serious, the energy investment in maintaining a continuous fire was almost always justified. The fire was banked at night, covered with ash to slow its combustion to a smolder, keeping the embers alive without consuming fuel at full rate, and revived in the morning by raking the ash aside, adding fresh fuel to the glowing core, and blowing gently until the flames caught. The tools for this revival were simple: a poker or fire iron for raking, a bellows in households that could afford one, and failing that, just a pair of human lungs applied close to the embers with careful, measured breath. Getting the morning fire going was typically the first task of whoever rose earliest, and in most medieval households this person was the woman of the house, though the historical reality of gendered labor division was considerably more fluid and variable than the simplified version suggests. What the records agree on is that firetending was skilled work. Knowing how much fuel to add, how to position it for efficient combustion, when to bank and when to let burn freely, how to read the fire's behavior as a guide to the wood's moisture content and the day's weather. All of this was practical knowledge that took years to acquire and that a competent firetender applied unconsciously, the way a modern person drives a car, without consciously thinking through every decision. The fuel itself varied by region in ways that significantly affected the quality and character of winter warmth. In forested areas of northern France, Germany, and England, hardwood, oak, beech, ash provided dense, slow-burning fuel that held heat well and produced relatively little smoke compared to softwoods or other combustibles. In areas where wood was scarce, peat was the fuel of choice, and peat fires have a quality entirely their own. They burn slowly at lower temperatures than wood, producing a thick, aromatic smoke that saturates everything it touches with a distinctive earthy smell that anyone who has spent time in rural Ireland or Scotland will recognize immediately. Peat was cut during summer in the boggy uplands, stacked to dry, and carried home in quantities that represented weeks of physical labor, and a household's peat stack was as carefully managed as its grain store, because running out of peat in February was an emergency with no easy solution. In some coastal areas and in the English Midlands, sea coal and surface coal were used from remarkably early in the medieval period. Coal fires in London are documented from the 12th century onward, and the smoke they produced was already generating complaints about air quality by the 13th century, which means that urban air pollution is genuinely a medieval problem and not purely a product of industrialization, which is the kind of fact that makes you feel slightly better about the present and slightly worse about human nature in general. Coal burned hotter than wood or peat, required different management, and produced a heavier, darker smoke, but it also produced more heat per unit of volume, which in a city where fuel had to be transported and was therefore expensive, made it a practical choice despite its drawbacks. The smoke was everywhere, and dealing with it was one of the defining sensory experiences of medieval interior life. In the earliest and simplest hearth arrangements, there was no chimney, just a hole or louved vent in the roof above the central hearth, and the smoke was supposed to find its way up and out through this opening while the warm air stayed below. In practice, it did not always work this way. Wind direction, atmospheric pressure, the height and pitch of the roof, the moisture content of the fuel, the draft created by doors and window shutters, all of these variables affected where the smoke went, and on bad days it went sideways, filling the room with a haze that made eyes water and throats tighten and drove everyone down toward the floor where the air was cleaner. Medieval people were accustomed to a level of smoke inhalation in their daily lives that would trigger immediate health concerns in a modern context, and the long-term respiratory consequences of spending decades in smoke-filled interiors were real, documented in the skeletal and dental remains of medieval individuals, and entirely unremarkable to the people experiencing them. The chimney, when it arrived, was not a single invention but a gradual evolution that proceeded at different rates in different regions and social classes. Stone-built chimneys became common in wealthier English and French homes from the 12th and 13th centuries onward, and their effect on domestic life was transformative, not just because they removed the smoke more efficiently, but because they created an upward draft that dramatically increased the fire's combustion efficiency, meaning more heat from the same amount of fuel. The fireplace moved from the center of the room to the wall, which changed the entire spatial logic of the interior, allowing upper floors to be added above the now smoke-free main room and enabling the development of the multi-story house. The chimney is, in an entirely literal sense, the architectural event that made the medieval house taller, and by extension the medieval town denser, and by extension the medieval city possible. But most of your village does not have chimneys yet, or has simple smoke hoods of plaster or timber that approximate the function without the full engineering. You have the central hearth, the hole in the roof, and the accumulated soot on every surface of your interior that has been deposited over years of daily fires and that gives old buildings their distinctive darkened rafters. That soot is also, incidentally, a mild insecticide, which kept certain pest populations in the thatch under control, and a preservative, which is part of why smoked meats were hung in the rafters near the roof. They got a secondary smoking from the domestic fire that supplemented their initial curing and extended their shelf life. Medieval houses were, in this sense, continuous smoking chambers and everything inside them, the food, the walls, the furniture, the clothing, the people, bore the chemical signature of 1,000 fires. Warming the body directly, rather than warming the room, was a parallel strategy that operated alongside the central fire. Bed warmers, metal pans on long handles, filled with hot coals from the fire and passed between the sheets before climbing in, appear in the historical record from the later medieval period and represent a piece of domestic technology so sensible and effective that they continued in use into the 20th century in rural areas without central heating. The process was simple. You filled the pan with glowing coals, closed it, ran it back and forth between the cold linen sheets for a few minutes to drive out the chill, removed it before the sheets could scorch, and then climbed into a bed that was warm right down to the foot. This is, genuinely, one of the more civilized inventions of the pre-modern world, and the fact that we have replaced it with electric blankets rather than improving it suggests that we did not find a fundamentally better solution so much as a more convenient one. Hot stones from the fire's edge, wrapped in cloth, performed the same warming function and were probably more common in households that could not afford a proper bed warmer. You heated the stone in the fire for an hour, wrapped it in a piece of wool or leather to protect the skin, and took it to bed with you, where it would release its stored heat slowly through the night, keeping your feet warm for several hours before cooling to an inert lump by morning. This is the same principle as the modern hot water bottle, and if you have ever used one on a cold night, you understand immediately why medieval people found it worth the effort. Warming drinks were another crucial tool, and this is where we encounter one of the more enjoyable aspects of medieval winter survival: the entirely practical and medically endorsed consumption of warm, spiced, alcoholic beverages on cold days. Ale was the baseline drink of medieval life, water was unreliable in quality, and the fermentation process that produced ale also killed most of the pathogens that made untreated water dangerous, which medieval people did not understand microbiologically but understood empirically in the sense that people who drank ale got sick less often than people who drank from certain water sources. Warm ale, heated with a hot poker plunged directly into the drinking vessel, a technique that produced a satisfying hiss and a pleasantly caramelized flavor, was a standard winter warming drink across all social classes. Add spices, ginger, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg for those who could afford them, and you had something approaching the mulled wine and wassail traditions that survived into modern Christmas culture, carrying their medieval thermal logic into a world where you could just turn the heating up instead. The dangers of staying warm were real and occasionally fatal, and medieval people were aware of them in the pragmatic way of people who have seen the consequences. Falling asleep too close to the fire was a genuine household hazard. Sparks, the shift of an unsupported log, the slow spread of smoldering floor rushes could start a house fire with devastating speed in an entirely combustible interior. Medieval urban fire was a catastrophic recurring event in every city and large town. The great fires that periodically destroyed sections of London, Paris, and other medieval cities all had their origins in domestic hearths that got out of control. Individual rural households had the same risk on a smaller scale, and the instructions in medieval household management texts to bank the fire carefully before sleeping and to ensure nothing combustible was left in direct contact with the embers were not bureaucratic caution. They were the distilled wisdom of communities that had lost houses and people to careless fire management. Carbon monoxide poisoning, though unnamed and not understood mechanistically, was another real hazard of poorly ventilated winter interiors. The symptoms, headache, dizziness, confusion, progressive drowsiness, were attributed to bad air, to spiritual causes, to the malign influence of night demons, to almost anything except the colorless gas being produced by smoldering fires in sealed rooms. Historians still argue whether some of the mysterious overnight deaths recorded in medieval documents, entire families found dead in their homes on winter mornings, were attributable to carbon monoxide rather than the disease outbreaks or acts of violence that contemporary chroniclers assumed. The truth is probably that both explanations account for some of the cases, and the medieval world had no way to distinguish between them. And yet, despite the smoke and the carbon monoxide and the fire hazard and the cold that crept back in every time the fire burned low, the hearth remained the emotional center of winter life in a way that transcends pure utility. There is something about fire that operates directly on the human nervous system below the level of conscious thought. The flickering light, the radiant warmth, the sound of burning wood, the smell of wood smoke, all of it triggering responses that are genuinely ancient, genuinely deep, genuinely shared across every human culture that has ever existed in a cold climate. The medieval person sitting by their hearth on a January evening, watching the flames, was experiencing something that connected them backward through every generation of their ancestors and forward to every generation of their descendants. An unbroken thread of warmth and light that the modern radiator, for all its efficiency, simply cannot replicate. You add another log. The fire brightens. Outside, the wind is doing something complicated and unpleasant in the thatch. Inside, the amber light moves across the faces of your household. The animals at the far end breathe their slow, warm breath, and the darkness beyond your walls is very large and very cold and very, very present. But the fire is going. The fire is always going. And as long as the fire is going, you are, in the most fundamental sense, fine. The fire is going, the house is holding, and your body is doing what bodies do in cold conditions, burning through its reserves faster than it would in summer, demanding more fuel more often with less patience for the kind of dietary monotony that winter inevitably delivers. Because here is the thing about medieval winter eating that tends to get glossed over in the more romantic accounts of the period. It was, for the vast majority of people, extraordinarily repetitive. Not unpleasant in every respect, not devoid of flavor or craft, but repetitive in a way that modern people, accustomed to year-round access to every ingredient from every climate on Earth, would find genuinely difficult to endure. You ate what you had stored in the forms that storage allowed, prepared with the techniques available to you day after day after day for 4 to 5 months. The menu did not change because the season did not change. You were, in the most literal sense, eating your way through your autumn's work, and the eating was both sustenance and a kind of slow countdown. The foundation of almost every meal, in almost every social stratum below the nobility, was pottage. Pottage is a word that covers an enormous range of preparations, from the thin, almost broth-like gruel of the genuinely poor to the thick, richly flavored stews of the moderately comfortable. But its basic principle was always the same: grains and whatever else you had, cooked together in water over the fire until everything softened into a cohesive mass. Oats, barley, dried peas, lentils, whatever root vegetables remained in the cellar, flavored with salt and whatever dried herbs were hanging from the rafters: thyme, sage, parsley, dried onion, and sometimes enriched with a piece of salt pork or a ham bone that had been contributing flavor to the pot for so many days that it had given up every last molecule of taste it possessed, and was now essentially a philosophical concept of meat rather than an actual piece of protein. The pottage pot was, in many households, essentially continuous. You did not make a fresh pot of pottage for every meal. You made a large pot, kept it warm at the fire's edge, ate from it, and added more ingredients as you went, refreshing it rather than emptying and starting again. This was efficient. It conserved fuel by keeping one vessel warm rather than heating things from cold repeatedly, and it meant that the pottage you were eating on Thursday had a theoretical continuity with the pottage you had started on Monday. Layers of flavor accumulating in a way that was sometimes genuinely delicious and sometimes, toward the end of a long winter, a record of every questionable culinary decision made over the preceding weeks. Medieval cookery writers occasionally described this continuous pot approvingly, as a technique that developed depth of flavor. Historians still argue whether the continuous pottage pot was primarily an economic strategy or a genuine culinary choice, and the honest answer is almost certainly that the two were inseparable. The most economical solution also happened to produce food that tasted better than starting fresh each time, and medieval cooks were pragmatic enough to appreciate both advantages simultaneously. Bread was the other constant, and the bread of the medieval peasantry was nothing like the soft, pale loaves that the word conjures for a modern audience. Rye bread, dense, dark, slightly sour from the natural fermentation of the rye starter used in its leavening, was the daily bread of the northern European peasant, and it was baked in batches large enough to last several days. Because bread baking required significant fuel to heat the communal or household oven to the necessary temperature, and heating an oven for a single small loaf was wasteful in a way no medieval household could afford. The result was bread that was fresh and relatively soft on baking day, progressively harder and drier over the following days, and by the end of its useful life a substance that required dunking in liquid pottage, ale, broth, to be safely consumed by anyone without exceptional teeth. Medieval bread being dunked in medieval ale is not a scene of poverty. It is a scene of practical eating, of using what you have in the way that makes most physical sense. The flavoring of this winter diet was dominated by salt, not as a seasoning choice but as a preservation necessity, which meant that the food you were eating in January and February tasted primarily of salt, which was both the thing keeping it safe to eat and the reason it needed significant dilution before cooking. Soaking salt meat overnight before use was not optional, it was mandatory, because eating unsoaked salt pork straight was an exercise in cardiovascular ambition that even medieval physicians, without the concept of sodium, recognized as inadvisable based purely on the visible effects of very salty diets on the human body. The soaking water was then sometimes used as the base liquid for pottage because discarding it would mean discarding salt, and salt was too valuable to waste, which meant your pottage was still fairly salty, which meant your ale consumption was correspondingly higher, which meant your hydration was maintained through fermented grain beverages, which is a medieval dietary loop that has a certain internal logic even if it would confuse a modern nutritionist. Spices occupied a fascinating position in the medieval winter diet, one that reveals a great deal about the relationship between preservation, flavor, and medicine in the medieval mind. For the wealthy, spices pepper, ginger, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, saffron were used in quantities that strike modern food historians as almost aggressive, added to both sweet and savory dishes in combinations that we would now consider bizarre. This was not a failure of taste. It was partly a preservation strategy. Many spices have genuine antimicrobial properties that helped slow spoilage in an era without refrigeration, and partly a medical philosophy, rooted in the humoral theory that dominated medieval medicine, which held that spices were heating foods that counteracted the cold, moist qualities of winter and brought the body's humoral balance back into health-promoting equilibrium. Eating heavily spiced food in winter was, in the medieval framework, a medical intervention as much as a culinary preference. You were not just making your salt pork taste better. You were actively treating your body's winter condition. For the poor, real spices were largely unaffordable, but the same underlying philosophy expressed itself through the use of locally available flavorings with perceived warming properties. Mustard seed, which could be grown and processed domestically, was used as a condiment and a medicine. Horseradish root, dug from the frozen ground or stored from autumn, provided the sharp, heating flavor that medieval bodies craved and that humoral theory endorsed. Dried herbs from the summer garden, the bundles hanging from your rafters that we noticed in the house earlier, were the accessible pharmacy and spice rack of the ordinary household, and a skilled cook knew how to use them to make the monotonous winter menu taste of something other than salt and gray vegetable. One of the quirkier corners of medieval winter eating involves a practice that was simultaneously nutritional, social, and slightly alarming to modern sensibilities: the consumption of blood. Not in any Gothic or ritualistic sense, but purely practically. When you slaughtered an animal in November, every part of it was used, including the blood, which was collected, mixed with grain, fat, and seasonings, and made into blood sausages, blood puddings, and similar preparations that preserved the blood's nutritional content in a form that would last through winter storage. Black pudding, white pudding, boudin, these are the direct descendants of medieval blood preservation traditions, and they exist on breakfast menus across Europe today as a kind of culinary fossil of the autumn slaughter, carrying their medieval logic into a world where blood preservation is no longer a survival strategy but a cultural preference that people defend with surprising passion. The fishing traditions of Lent and fast days forced medieval winter eating into a particular rhythm that varied the diet in ways that might actually have been nutritionally beneficial, even if the motivation was purely religious. The requirement to abstain from meat on Fridays and throughout Advent and Lent meant that dried fish, stockfish and salt herring primarily, with freshwater fish from local rivers and ponds for those with access, appeared on the table with a regularity that provided protein and, in the case of fatty fish like herring, significant quantities of the omega-3 oils that supported brain function, joint health, and the immune system in ways that medieval nutrition theory could not explain but that the body's response to the diet suggested empirically. Herring was cheap, abundant, and nutritionally dense. It was also, by late winter, absolutely everywhere on the table and increasingly unwelcome, which is why medieval literature contains a recurring motif of characters longing for fresh meat during Lent. Not because the herring was dangerous, but because 4 months of it was more than enough. The ale that accompanied all of this deserves its own moment of attention. Medieval ale, distinct from hopped beer, which arrived later and kept longer, was brewed frequently and consumed quickly, because without hops as a preservative it soured within a week or two. This meant that ale production was a near-continuous household activity in winter, the smell of fermenting grain a permanent background note in the domestic interior alongside the wood smoke and the animals. Ale was not merely a beverage. It was a caloric source. Medieval ale was considerably more nutritious than modern beer, lower in alcohol and higher in dissolved starches and proteins from the grain, a hydration source, a warming drink, and a social lubricant all simultaneously. Children drank it diluted. The elderly drank it as a digestive aid. Laborers drank it as part of their caloric budget. The sick drank warm ale as medicine. A household without ale in winter was a household in trouble, and the ability to brew was a practical skill as essential as the ability to cook. The nobility and wealthy merchants ate a winter diet that was recognizably related to the peasant diet in its structural logic. Preserved meats, dried legumes, winter root vegetables, bread, ale, but elaborated with resources that transformed the experience almost beyond recognition. Great households maintained elaborate spice inventories, kept fish ponds stocked with live carp and other freshwater fish that provided fresh protein through the winter months, received game from hunted deer and wild boar, imported luxury dried fruits, figs, dates, raisins from the Mediterranean, and employed cooks of sufficient skill to make even the preserved and dried ingredients of winter taste genuinely elaborate. A medieval feast in January, at a great hall, would have included dishes that modern food historians describe as genuinely sophisticated, complex spice sauces, elaborate pastry constructions, the interplay of sweet and savory in a single dish that was the hallmark of medieval haute cuisine. But that feast was not your dinner. Your dinner was pottage with a bit of salt pork if you were lucky, and rye bread, and ale, and the particular satisfaction of warm food on a cold day that transcends any question of culinary sophistication. There is a moment in the literature of medieval food history that researchers keep returning to, the accounts from monastery chronicles of the simple meal of pottage and bread provided to travelers and pilgrims at monastery gates during winter. The recipients of these meals, people who had been walking through freezing weather, wet and exhausted, describe the experience of receiving warm food at a monastery gate in terms that are almost ecstatic. Not because the food was extraordinary, because it was warm and there was enough of it, and they had been cold and uncertain and now they were neither, and in that specific context, pottage from a monastery cauldron was the best thing they had ever tasted. This is the emotional reality of medieval winter eating that the historical record occasionally allows us to glimpse through the ledgers and the recipe books and the agricultural surveys. The food was monotonous. The food was salty and repetitive and nutritionally unbalanced in ways that left marks on medieval bodies that forensic analysis can still read. But it was also hot, and it was also shared, and it was also the product of months of collective labor, and consuming it together around the fire on a dark January evening was an act of community and survival and, in its own way, of grace. Your bowl is warm in your hands. The pottage is the same as yesterday's pottage and will probably be the same as tomorrow's. The ale is slightly sour and exactly right. Somewhere outside, the wind is still at the thatch, but in here the fire is good and the food is warm and the people around you are the people you would choose, mostly if choosing were a thing you did. It is enough. On a medieval winter evening, it is entirely, completely enough. The pottage is warm inside you, the ale has taken the edge off the cold that lives permanently in your extremities, and now you have to get up and go outside. Because the animals need tending and the woodpile needs assessing, and the world does not pause for your comfort simply because it is January and the temperature has dropped below the point where exposed skin starts making urgent complaints. You pull on your outer layer and feel, as you always feel at this moment, the specific texture of medieval wool against your skin, and this is where we need to spend some time, because the clothing that medieval people wore in winter was not simply a matter of fashion or social signaling, though it was certainly both of those things as well. It was a survival system, engineered from available materials by centuries of accumulated textile knowledge, and understanding it properly means understanding both its considerable ingenuity and its significant limitations. Wool was the foundation of everything. Not the soft, fine merino that fills modern outdoor clothing stores, but a range of wool types from coarse and hard-wearing to finer and softer depending on the breed of sheep and the quality of processing. And the processing of medieval wool was a long, skilled, labor-intensive sequence of operations that employed a substantial proportion of the medieval workforce. Shearing, washing, carding or combing, spinning, weaving, fulling, finishing. Each step could be done more or less well, and the quality of the final cloth reflected every decision made along the way. The finest English and Flemish woolens were luxury goods traded across Europe. The rougher woolens produced for everyday peasant use were serviceable rather than beautiful, but serviceable in the most important sense. They kept the wearer alive. Wool's thermal properties derive from the same structural feature that makes it useful for insulation of all kinds. The natural crimp of the fiber, which traps air in tiny pockets between the strands and between the fibers within each strand. This trapped air is what insulates, not the wool itself, but the air it holds still. A thick layer of woolen cloth holds a substantial volume of still air close to the body, creating a thermal barrier between body heat and cold outside air that is genuinely effective, particularly when the wool retains some of its natural lanolin content. Raw, unscoured wool contains lanolin, the greasy, waxy substance secreted by sheep's skin, in quantities that make it naturally water-resistant, and while medieval cloth processing removed much of this lanolin, working-class woolens retained more of it than the refined luxury cloths, which made the everyday working garment of the peasant slightly more weather-resistant than its expensive counterpart. There is a small irony in the fact that the cheapest cloth was, in one practical respect, better suited to outdoor winter work than the expensive fine weaves that signaled wealth and status. The layering principle, which modern cold-weather dressing has rediscovered and systematized into base layer, mid-layer, and shell, was understood and practiced in the medieval world without the theoretical framework. You wore a linen undergarment, a long shirt or chemise, next to the skin because linen, while less insulating than wool, was easier to wash than wool, dried faster than wool, and was less likely to cause the skin irritation that direct contact with coarse wool produced after extended wear. Against the skin, linen managed moisture reasonably well, wicking sweat away from the body surface in a function that modern fabric technology calls moisture management and that medieval people simply called not being wet inside your clothes, which was important because wet fabric loses most of its insulating value and wet skin loses heat dramatically faster than dry skin. Over the linen went wool, one layer or several depending on the severity of the cold and the resources of the wearer. The basic overgarment for both men and women was a long woolen tunic or kirtle, and over this went whatever additional layers the household possessed. A second tunic, a tabard, a woolen mantle or cloak that wrapped around the whole body and could be pulled close in wind or released for movement. The cloak was the medieval coat, and its value as a garment was so well understood that it appears constantly in medieval wills, bequeathed by name as a significant possession. A good heavy woolen cloak was worth real money and lasted decades with care, and the person receiving one in a bequest understood that they had been given something genuinely useful rather than merely sentimental. The head, hands, and feet were the thermal weak points of the medieval dressed body, and the ingenuity directed at protecting them is both impressive and occasionally quite touching. The coif, a close-fitting linen cap tied under the chin, was worn by people of both sexes and all ages across the medieval period, and it addressed the basic thermal fact that a substantial proportion of body heat is lost through the head if the head is unprotected. Over the coif, a woolen hood could be pulled up in bad weather, The medieval hood was a more versatile garment than it sounds, often featuring a long tail called a liripipe that could be wrapped around the neck as additional insulation or used to secure the hood in wind. The combination of coif and hood, layered, was the medieval hat and scarf solution, providing coverage from crown to collarbone in a single integrated system. Mittens and gloves were the subject of a social distinction that reveals something interesting about the medieval relationship between warmth and dexterity. Mittens, a single compartment for all 4 fingers with a separate thumb, were warmer than gloves because they allowed the fingers to share body heat with each other rather than insulating each digit separately. Gloves, which preserved manual dexterity, were associated with higher status and with activities, riding, falconry, certain kinds of administrative work that required fine motor control. The working peasant wore mittens in hard weather, accepted the limitation on manual dexterity, and got the warmth. The noble wore gloves, accepted slightly colder hands, and got the social signaling. This trade-off between function and status is a recurring theme in medieval clothing, and it points to the persistent human tendency to sacrifice practical advantage for symbolic distinction even in genuinely dangerous conditions. Feet were perhaps the most vulnerable part of the medieval winter body, and the footwear available to most people was substantially less effective than modern cold-weather boots. Leather shoes and boots, while providing some protection from wet ground and physical hazards, were not insulated in the way that modern thermal footwear is, and wet leather loses most of its protective value. The solutions were layering. Multiple pairs of woolen hose worn simultaneously, thick wool stockings that extended up the leg, and the use of wooden pattens, raised wooden platforms that strapped over normal shoes and lifted the foot above the mud and snow, reducing the rate at which ground cold conducted upward through the sole. Pattens were a distinctly medieval piece of technology, widespread enough to be unremarkable in towns and villages, creating the distinctive clattering sound on cobblestones that medieval urban soundscapes would have included as a background constant. They look, to modern eyes, like a very early precursor of the platform shoe, which is technically accurate and entirely misses the point. Fur was the luxury thermal material of the medieval world, and the hierarchy of furs mirrored the hierarchy of society with a precision that sumptuary laws attempted to regulate and human aspiration consistently undermined. Ermine, the white winter coat of the stoat, was reserved for royalty and the highest nobility, its distinctive black-tipped tails creating the spotted pattern that became a heraldic symbol of the highest social rank. Sable, marten, and beaver fur were the luxury materials of the wealthy merchant and minor nobility. Squirrel, rabbit, and sheepskin were the affordable furs available to the middling classes and the skilled trades. And at the bottom of the fur hierarchy, worn by people who needed warmth and could not afford anything else, was the undyed, unprocessed sheepskin with the wool still attached, turned woolside inward and worn as a rough outer garment that was warm, slightly smelly, and entirely effective at keeping the wearer alive. The social politics of fur in medieval winter are genuinely fascinating. Sumptuary laws, regulations specifying which social classes were permitted to wear which materials, were enacted repeatedly across medieval Europe, attempting to maintain visible distinctions of rank at a time when rising merchant wealth was making luxury materials increasingly accessible below their traditionally prescribed social levels. These laws were consistently and enthusiastically ignored. A prosperous wool merchant in 14th century Florence or a successful cloth trader in medieval London, who could afford a fur-lined cloak, was going to wear a fur-lined cloak regardless of what the law specified, and the repeated reenactment of sumptuary regulations is itself evidence that they were not working. If people had been obeying them, there would have been no need to keep reissuing them. Historians still argue whether sumptuary laws had any meaningful social effect or were primarily aspirational statements of the social order that the nobility wished existed, and the evidence generally supports the more cynical interpretation. The repair and maintenance of clothing was as important as its initial production, because in a world where fabric was hand-produced and therefore expensive relative to most household incomes, discarding a worn garment was not the first response to damage. It was approximately the last one. Clothing was mended, patched, darned, let out, taken in, remade into smaller garments as the wearer shrank with age or the garment degraded, cut down for children, repurposed into rags, and finally used as stuffing or tinder only when it was truly beyond any further textile use. The skill of needlework, primarily but not exclusively associated with women in the medieval period, was not a decorative accomplishment. It was a household economic skill of the first order, because a household that could repair its own clothing extended the life of its textile inventory indefinitely and avoided the significant expense of replacement. Washing winter clothing presented its own set of challenges. Full immersion washing of woolen garments risked felting, the irreversible matting of wool fibers that occurs when they are agitated in hot water, which would ruin the garment's fit and draping while actually increasing its insulating value at the cost of its usefulness as a shaped garment. Medieval washerwomen knew this, and woolens were spot-cleaned, aired, beaten to remove surface dirt, and treated with a restraint that was partly care for the fabric and partly a reflection of the fact that washing in winter meant wet fabric that needed to dry somewhere, and drying space inside a small, smoke-filled medieval house was limited. Linen undergarments were washed more frequently, being more robust to the process and more important to keep clean from a comfort and skin health perspective. The smell of medieval winter clothing is something historians approach with a mixture of scholarly detachment and private horror. Woolen garments worn for months with limited washing, in proximity to fire smoke, animal odors, and the general biological richness of a medieval interior, developed a patina of use that was both characteristic and, to modern nostrils, significant. But here is the quirky historical footnote that tends to reframe this. Medieval people were acutely aware of personal odor and had strong social norms around it. They used aromatic herbs, lavender, rosemary, dried flowers, placed among stored clothing to combat the smell of long storage. They washed their hands and faces regularly even when full-body bathing was infrequent. The smell of medieval clothing was not evidence of indifference to cleanliness. It was the inevitable result of living in conditions where full thermal and practical cleanliness was genuinely difficult to achieve simultaneously, and medieval people navigated this constraint with the same pragmatic creativity they brought to every other challenge the season presented. You are dressed now, layered and cloaked and mittened, the coif tied under your chin and the hood pulled up against the gray morning air, and you step outside into a world that is white and still and brutally cold and yours to navigate for another day. Your clothing is doing what it was made to do. It is not comfortable by your 21st century standards. It is not waterproof in the modern sense. It will not keep you dry if you stand in rain for an hour. But it is warm enough, which is all warm enough needs to be, and the people who made it and wore it and repaired it and passed it down and remade it into smaller versions for their children were not primitive or ignorant or resigned to suffering. They were textile engineers working with available materials, and what they built from sheep and linen plants and needles and thread was a system that kept the human body functional in northern European winters for centuries. You are dressed and outside and the cold is doing what cold does. Finding the gaps, testing the layers, settling into your fingers despite the mittens and reminding your feet, through the soles of your boots and the packed snow beneath them, that the ground itself has given up on warmth for the season. But you are not alone out here, and you are not alone inside either. And this is perhaps the single most important survival fact of medieval winter that modern retellings consistently underemphasize: the profound, practical, life-saving importance of other people. Not other people in the abstract, sentimental sense of community as a warm feeling, but other people in the specific, concrete sense of bodies that generate heat, hands that share labor, voices that keep the dark at bay, and relationships that distribute risk across enough individuals that no single household has to absorb a catastrophic loss entirely on its own. Medieval winter survival was a collective enterprise, and the social structures that organized that collectivity were as carefully engineered as the houses and the clothing and the food stores, because they needed to be. The village community operated in winter as a mutual aid network of a sophistication that tends to get obscured by the political and legal frameworks, the feudal obligations, the manorial system, the church hierarchy, that historians use to describe medieval social organization. Underneath those frameworks, at the level of daily life, was a dense web of reciprocal obligations and shared resources that made the difference between a community that survived hard winters and one that did not. You lent your neighbor the use of your ox when he needed plowing done. He helped you repair your roof before the worst weather arrived. The widow at the edge of the village received firewood from households that had surplus and contributed what she could in return: knowledge, childcare, labor when her health allowed. The family whose cow had died in autumn received milk from the family whose cow had not, with the understanding that the favor would be remembered and repaid in some form when circumstances allowed. This was not charity in the modern sense, with its implied hierarchy of giver and receiver. It was insurance, a distributed system of mutual obligation that functioned as a social safety net in an era before any institutional equivalent existed. The anthropological term for this kind of arrangement is reciprocal altruism, which is a clinical phrase for something that felt, at the human level, more like loyalty and obligation and the specific warmth of knowing that your community would not let you die if it could possibly prevent it. Medieval communities were not uniformly kind or generous. The historical record contains plenty of evidence of disputes, hoarding, exploitation, and the abandonment of the genuinely marginal. But the baseline expectation of mutual support in crisis was real and functional and kept people alive in winters where individual household resources were insufficient. The physical gathering of community in winter served thermal as well as social purposes, and medieval people understood this pragmatically. The great hall of the local lord, even a relatively modest manor rather than a grand castle, was a space where the larger community could and did gather on the coldest nights, where the combined body heat of many people and the lord's more substantial fuel supply created a warmth that smaller individual households could not match. This gathering was not purely voluntary or sentimental. It was an expected dimension of the social contract between lord and tenant. The lord provided shelter and warmth in extremis, and the tenants provided labor and loyalty in return, and this exchange was sufficiently formalized that its failure on the lord's part was a recognizable social breach with real consequences for his standing and authority. The church occupied the same thermal social role at the village level. Stone churches held heat differently than timber domestic buildings, more slowly but more persistently, and a church that had been heated by the candles and bodies of a congregation through a winter service was genuinely warmer than the outside air for some time afterward. The gathering of the community for religious observance in winter was simultaneously a social event, a spiritual event, and a thermal strategy, and medieval people experienced it as all three without any sense of contradiction, because the boundaries between the practical and the sacred were not where we tend to draw them. You went to church in January because God required it, and because the priest expected it, and because it was warmer there than at home, and because your neighbors would be there and you had things to discuss, and because the rhythm of the liturgical calendar gave structure to days that might otherwise blur into an undifferentiated gray monotony. All of these motivations operated simultaneously. The animals that shared the medieval winter landscape were social participants in a way that goes beyond the thermal contribution we noted when we were examining the longhouse. The relationship between medieval farmers and their livestock was characterized by an intimacy and a mutual dependence that shaped both parties in ways that are difficult to fully appreciate from a modern vantage point, where most people's relationship with animals is either pet ownership or supermarket packaging. Your cow was not a commodity. She was a member of the household with a name and a temperament and a history, whose health you monitored with the same attention you gave to your children's health, whose survival through winter was a matter of direct economic and emotional significance. You knew her individual habits, her preferences, her particular complaints. She knew you. The winter months spent in close proximity, you in one end of the longhouse, she in the other, deepened this familiarity into something that contemporary sources occasionally describe in terms that blur the line between practical assessment and genuine affection. This relationship with livestock extended to the work of winter animal husbandry, which was considerable. Animals kept through winter needed feeding from stored hay and grain, needed their bedding changed, needed water that was not frozen, needed monitoring for illness. The daily cycle of animal care, feeding in the morning, watering, checking, feeding again in the evening, provided a structure to the winter day that served a psychological function beyond its practical necessity. Having things that depended on you, tasks that could not be deferred, obligations that got you out of bed and outside even on the worst mornings. This structure was a defense against the particular psychological deterioration that extended cold, darkness, and confinement can produce in human beings. Medieval people did not have a clinical vocabulary for seasonal depression, but they had the lived experience of the dark season's effect on mood and motivation, and the rhythm of animal care was one of the mechanisms that kept that darkness from becoming overwhelming. The social life of medieval winter evenings deserves its own extended consideration, because it was both more organized and more creative than the simple image of people huddled silently by fires suggests. The long, dark evenings were filled with activity. Not the frantic, productive activity of the harvest season, but the slower, more reflective work that cold weather and limited light permitted. Spinning and weaving, which required less daylight than outdoor agricultural work, occupied hands while voices were free to talk and sing and tell stories. The distaff and spindle were tools so associated with winter evenings that they became symbolic of the domestic feminine sphere across medieval European culture, and the sound of spinning, the rhythmic whir of the spindle, the soft thump of the loom, was the soundtrack of winter interiors. Storytelling was the primary entertainment of the medieval winter evening, and it was storytelling of a quality and a function that we have largely lost. In a world without recorded media, without books for the majority of the population, without any form of entertainment that was not produced live by present human beings, the person who could tell a story well was a community resource of genuine value. Stories served multiple functions simultaneously. They entertained, obviously, but they also transmitted cultural knowledge, reinforced social norms, explained the world in terms that the available intellectual frameworks could accommodate, and provided the psychological processing that human beings need to make sense of their experience. A skilled winter storyteller was not merely a source of amusement. They were a teacher, a therapist, a historian, and a moral philosopher all at once, and the medieval community's investment in the maintenance and transmission of its story traditions was an investment in its own psychological survival. The stories told in medieval winter evenings ranged from the heroic and legendary, the great cycles of Arthurian romance, the Norse sagas in the northern regions, the chansons de geste of French-speaking Europe, to the local and immediate tales of the village's own past, accounts of remarkable individuals, cautionary stories about the consequences of violating social norms, ghost stories and supernatural narratives that populated the dark beyond the firelight with beings whose existence explained misfortune and provided a framework for fear. Historians still argue whether medieval people fully believed in the supernatural entities that populated their winter stories. The various spirits, demons, and uncanny beings that feature in folk narrative traditions, or whether the stories were understood as fiction even by their original audiences. The evidence suggests a spectrum of belief, ranging from the deeply literal to the knowingly metaphorical, with most people occupying a comfortable middle ground where the stories were true in the ways that mattered without being factually verifiable in the ways that were testable. Games occupied the winter evenings alongside stories. Chess, which had arrived in Europe via the Islamic world, was played in noble and wealthy merchant households. Simpler board games, variations on marils, backgammon, and dice games were played across the social spectrum, with dice appearing in archaeological contexts from the grandest castle to the humblest village. Card games arrived in Europe in the late 14th century and spread with remarkable speed, suggesting that they met a genuine recreational need in a population that had limited options for structured entertainment. Physical games, wrestling, various forms of ball play, competitive feats of strength, were practiced in the open spaces of the village even in winter, providing exercise, competitive release, and the particular social bonding that physical contest creates between men who otherwise spent their working lives in the same shared tasks. Music was another thread of the social fabric. Every community had people who could sing, and communal singing required no instruments, no literacy, no resources beyond the breath and the voice. It was the most democratically available form of organized beauty in the medieval world. The repertoire mixed sacred and secular without the sharp distinction that later periods imposed. Work songs, love songs, drinking songs, lullabies, and the great liturgical repertoire of the church existed in the same cultural space, performed by the same people, heard by the same ears. Caroling, the tradition of communal singing associated now specifically with Christmas, was originally a broader tradition of seasonal communal music making that marked the winter calendar with regular occasions for gathering and singing, which was simultaneously a religious observance, a social event, and a morale maintenance strategy of real psychological importance. The winter calendar itself, structured by the church's liturgical year, and the older seasonal festivals that the church had absorbed or suppressed with varying success, provided a sequence of anticipated events that broke the monotony of the long dark season into manageable segments. Christmas was the central event, but it was surrounded by a constellation of saints' days, feast days, and folk observances that gave almost every week of the winter some specific character and anticipated pleasure. Twelfth Night, Candlemas, the feast of various local saints, Plough Monday, the return to agricultural work after Christmas. All of these marked time passing and gave the community-specific occasions to gather, eat together, mark the season, and remind themselves that winter was progressing toward its end even on the days when it seemed permanent. The lord of the manor's obligation to provide feast day hospitality was a real social institution with real redistributive consequences. On Christmas and the major feast days, great households were expected to provide food and drink to their tenants and dependents in quantities that constituted a meaningful supplement to those households' winter food supplies. A significant feast day meal at the manor provided protein, ale, and warmth that many tenant families could not generate from their own stores alone, and the social visibility of this provision, the fact that it happened publicly, that everyone in the community knew what had been given and received, reinforced both the lord's status and the social contract that justified it. Generosity at feast days was not optional for a lord who wished to maintain his community's loyalty and goodwill. It was a structural expectation, and lords who failed to meet it were noted, resented, and occasionally subjected to the various forms of collective pressure that medieval communities had at their disposal. The loneliness of medieval winter, when it came, was a specific and serious condition. Extended illness, geographic isolation, family bereavement, the particular vulnerability of old age in a season that tested physical resilience, all of these could produce states of isolation and despair that the community's social structures were not always sufficient to address. The monastery and the church provided some institutional response to isolated vulnerability, the tradition of offering hospitality to travelers, the obligation of parish priests to visit the sick and housebound, the presence of religious orders dedicated to care of the poor and sick. But the gaps in this provision were real, and the people who fell through them suffered genuinely. Winter loneliness was not sentimentalized in medieval culture the way it sometimes is in modern romantic readings of the period. It was a practical problem with practical consequences, and the communities that managed it best were the ones that maintained the densest and most active networks of mutual obligation and regular contact. Outside your window, if you had a window worth looking through, the village is not silent or still. Someone is splitting wood. Someone else is crossing to the well. 3 children are engaged in something involving snow that has not yet escalated to tears but is clearly building toward it. The sound of a cow lowing comes from somewhere across the lane. The smoke from a dozen hearths rises into the pale winter sky, each column a sign of a fire maintained, a household functioning, a family doing what families in this place have done for generations, holding together against the cold, drawing warmth from each other as much as from any fire, surviving not through individual heroism but through the accumulated, unremarkable, daily practice of being a community. The wood is split, the animals are tended, the community is doing what the community does, and you have made it through another week of winter without any particular disaster, which is not nothing. But winter has a way of finding the gaps in even the most carefully maintained defense, and the gap it finds most reliably, most personally, most inevitably, is the human body itself. Because the medieval body in winter was under a sustained assault from multiple directions simultaneously. Cold that depleted energy reserves, limited diet that created nutritional deficiencies, confinement that spread infectious illness through households and communities with a thoroughness that open-air summer living simply did not permit, and the accumulated physical stress of months of inadequate warmth and reduced caloric intake. And the medieval response to this assault was a fascinating, complicated, and occasionally counterproductive mixture of empirical observation, inherited wisdom, theological interpretation, and what we might generously call creative pharmacology. Let us begin with what they actually got right, because the tendency in popular history is to present medieval medicine as a parade of absurdities interrupted by occasional accidental successes, and that framing is both unfair and misleading. Medieval medical practice was built on the Galenic humoral tradition, the theory that health depended on the balance of 4 bodily humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, each associated with a season, an element, a temperament, and a set of physical qualities. And while this theoretical framework was wrong in its fundamental premises, it generated a practical approach to illness that had genuine empirical content. Centuries of observation had established, within the humoral framework, a body of clinical knowledge about which treatments helped which conditions, even if the explanations for why they helped were incorrect. The medieval physician who prescribed rest, warm drinks, and nutritious food for a winter fever was prescribing correctly for reasons he explained incorrectly, and the patient who followed his advice was better off than if he had done nothing. The particular vulnerabilities of winter were well understood in humoral terms. Winter was the season of phlegm, cold and moist, the most sluggish and health-threatening of the humoral qualities, and the illnesses of winter were understood as expressions of phlegmatic excess in the body. The runny nose, the chest congestion, the persistent cough, the heaviness and lethargy that accompanied winter illness were all, in humoral terms, manifestations of too much cold, moist phlegm overwhelming the body's natural warmth. The therapeutic response was therefore to counter cold with heat, moisture with dryness, warming foods, warming spices, warming drinks, rest in warm environments, and avoidance of cold and damp. This is, stripped of its theoretical framework, a reasonable prescription for supporting the immune system and managing the symptoms of respiratory illness, and it would have produced genuine relief even though it was generated by a completely wrong theory of disease. The specific illnesses that ravaged medieval winter populations were real and often serious. Respiratory infections, what we would now categorize as colds, influenza, pneumonia, and bronchitis, were endemic in winter and became epidemic in bad years. The combination of immune systems depleted by nutritional deficiency, bodies physically stressed by cold, and households crowded together sharing air created ideal conditions for respiratory pathogens to spread and intensify. Tuberculosis, which was common throughout the medieval period, became particularly lethal in winter when immune suppression was greatest, and the coughing that spread it was most frequent in the enclosed spaces where everyone was spending most of their time. The medieval winter cough was so universal that it registered in the historical record almost as background noise, mentioned in passing in household accounts and personal letters with the matter-of-fact tone of something too ordinary to require much comment. Frostbite and hypothermia, while not always named as such, appear in medieval medical texts under descriptions that make the conditions clearly recognizable. The whitening and loss of sensation in extremities, the dangerous drowsiness that preceded fatal cooling of the body core, the gangrene that followed severe frostbite in the days before amputation was sufficiently skilled to reliably save the patient. The treatments described range from the sensible, gradual rewarming in front of the fire, rubbing the affected parts with snow first and then with warm cloths, to the alarming, the application of animal fats and various herbal preparations to frostbitten skin in combinations that could cause further tissue damage. Historians still argue whether the medieval practice of rubbing frostbitten extremities with snow, which appears in multiple sources from different regions, was genuinely beneficial as a gradual rewarming technique or harmful as an additional source of tissue damage. And modern medicine's position on snow rubbing is firmly in the harmful column, but the medieval instinct to slow down the rewarming process rather than applying immediate intense heat was actually correct in principle, even if the specific technique was problematic. Folk medicine operated alongside learned Galenic medicine and was the primary resource for most of the population, who had no access to trained physicians and relied instead on the accumulated herbal and practical knowledge of their communities. The local wise woman, the experienced midwife, the elderly person who had lived through many winters and remembered what had helped in previous ones. These figures were the frontline medical practitioners for the majority of the medieval population, and the treatments they offered were a mixture of genuinely effective herbal pharmacology and ritually or spiritually framed interventions that the recipients often found meaningful and comforting, even where the physical efficacy was limited. The herbal pharmacopoeia of medieval winter medicine was surprisingly rich in genuinely active compounds. Elderberry, used in preparations for winter colds and fevers, contains compounds that modern research has confirmed have antiviral properties. Garlic, used widely as both a food and a medicine, has genuine antimicrobial action. Willow bark, used for fever and pain, contains salicin, the precursor of aspirin, in quantities sufficient to produce real analgesic and antipyretic effects. Valerian, used for sleep disturbance and anxiety, has sedative properties that have been confirmed by modern pharmacological analysis. The medieval herbalists did not know why these plants worked. They knew, from generations of observation, that they did, and this empirical knowledge was encoded in the herbal traditions and passed down through exactly the kind of community knowledge transmission that the winter storytelling evenings helped maintain. The more exotic ingredients of medieval medicine, and some of them were genuinely exotic, reflected the humoral theory's logic of treating like with unlike, countering cold with heating substances, countering dryness with moistening ones. Spices brought from the East at significant expense appeared in medical preparations as well as culinary ones, because the same heating properties that made ginger and pepper valuable in food made them therapeutically appropriate for cold weather illnesses in the humoral framework. The overlap between the kitchen and the apothecary in the medieval world was not a confusion of categories. It was a reflection of a unified theoretical system in which food and medicine operated on the same principles, and the distinction between them was one of degree rather than kind. One of the quirkier corners of medieval winter medicine involves the therapeutic use of animal products in ways that range from the empirically plausible to the entirely bewildering. Bear fat was considered a particularly effective treatment for cold-related conditions. Rubbed into the skin to prevent frostbite, consumed in small quantities to build internal warmth, and the logic was straightforward humoral reasoning: bears survive winter through their fat reserves. Therefore, bear fat contains the essence of winter-surviving warmth. Therefore, applying it to a human body transfers that quality. This is magical thinking, but it is structured magical thinking with an internal logic, and the practical effect of rubbing any fat into exposed skin in cold weather is to reduce heat loss through the skin surface. So the treatment was not entirely without benefit, even though the reasoning was entirely wrong. Medieval medicine was full of this kind of accidental correctness, which is one of the things that makes it so interesting to study. The spiritual dimension of medieval illness was not separate from the medical dimension. It was woven through it at every level, because in the medieval worldview, illness was always simultaneously a physical and a spiritual event. Sickness could be God's punishment for sin, a test of faith, the consequence of demonic influence, or simply the physical expression of humoral imbalance, and these explanations were not mutually exclusive. You could simultaneously seek treatment from a physician for the physical symptoms, confession from a priest for the spiritual dimension, and protective ritual from a folk practitioner for the supernatural dimension. And none of these consultations would seem contradictory to you because they addressed different aspects of a condition understood as inherently multidimensional. The saints provided a specialized resource for specific winter ailments. Saint Blaise was the patron saint of throat ailments, and his feast day on February 3rd, right in the depths of winter, when throat illness was at its most prevalent, was marked by a specific blessing ritual in which the priest held 2 candles crossed against the throat of each parishioner while invoking Blaise's protection. This ritual is still performed in Catholic churches today, which makes Saint Blaise's blessing one of the longest surviving pieces of medieval winter medicine. Whether the blessing had physical efficacy is not the point. The point is that it gave people something to do about their fear, a ritual action that asserted human agency in the face of suffering, and the psychological relief of such action was real and valuable in a context where the medical alternatives were limited. Childbirth in winter presented particular dangers that the medical and spiritual resources of the medieval community were mobilized to address. The cold itself was a hazard to both mother and newborn. A newborn infant has virtually no capacity for thermoregulation and is entirely dependent on external warmth for survival, and a winter birth in a cold house was a test of the household's ability to maintain adequate warmth in the immediate birth environment. Medieval midwifery texts specify, with considerable practical detail, the importance of ensuring the birth room was well heated, that warm water was available, and that the infant was immediately wrapped in warm cloths and held close to a warm body. This was not medical theory. This was hard-won empirical knowledge about neonatal survival, and it was correct. The mental health consequences of extended winter confinement were real and documented, even if the medieval vocabulary for them was different from ours. Aestia, a term from monastic literature usually translated as spiritual torpor or sloth, but describing something that sounds very much like what we would now recognize as depression, was understood in the medieval church as both a spiritual failing and a genuine psychological condition, and the monastic literature on its management contains advice that modern psychologists would largely recognize as reasonable: maintaining routine, physical activity, engagement with community, prayer as a focusing and meaning-making practice. The seasonal intensification of aesthesia in winter was noted by medieval writers, who understood that the dark months created particular vulnerability to this condition, and that the community's responsibility to maintain social engagement and activity was partly a response to that vulnerability. The death that winter brought was not always dramatic or sudden. Sometimes it was a slow diminishment, the elderly person whose reserves were insufficient, the child whose immune system could not manage one more respiratory infection, the person whose winter injury did not heal properly in conditions of cold and nutritional deficiency. Medieval communities were familiar with winter death in a way that we, insulated by modern medicine and nutrition and heating, have largely lost the visceral understanding of. Grief was a winter companion alongside cold and hunger, and the liturgical and community rituals surrounding death, the washing and preparation of the body, the church funeral, the communal mourning, provided structure for grief in the same way that the feast days provided structure for the broader experience of winter. The Church's promise of resurrection, celebrated at Easter just as winter finally ended, was not an abstract theological proposition for people who had buried neighbors and family members through the dark months. It was a specific, personal, desperately needed hope. And yet, winter illness was not the totality of the season's experience of the body. There were also the winter bodies that felt better in cold weather, the arthritic conditions that eased when the summer's agricultural labor ceased and the joints were given some rest, the particular quality of cold air breathing that medieval people described as bracing, the deep, restorative sleep that the long nights permitted in a way that the brief summer nights did not. The medieval body in winter was not simply a body under assault. It was a body that had been shaped by and adapted to the seasonal rhythm of cold and warmth, activity and rest, abundance and scarcity. A body that, in its own way, knew what winter was for, even when winter was hard, even when it hurt, even when the shelf was getting too close to empty and the fire was burning lower than you would like and the cough that started in November showed no particular interest in stopping before March. You take your warming drink, the ale heated with the fire iron, the ginger root grated into the cup because your chest has been tight since last week and the warmth of the spice seems to help, or at least seems to help, which may be the same thing. And you sit close to the fire and let the heat work on your hands, and you think about St. Blaise, whose day is coming soon, and about the fact that February has arrived, which means the worst is probably behind you, and you breathe the smoky, animal-warm, herb-scented air of your house and feel, cautiously, the first distant intimation of something that is not quite hope yet but is in the same family as hope, gathering somewhere at the edge of the season. February has arrived, and with it that cautious not-quite hope you felt at the end of your warming drink. And now you are in the strangest part of winter, the part that is neither the dramatic arrival of cold nor the crisis of deepest January, but the long, slow, psychologically demanding endurance of the final weeks, when the end is theoretically visible but practically still very far away, and the resources you accumulated with such care in autumn are entering the zone where the arithmetic starts to feel personal. The grain store is lower than it was. The salt meat barrel has been visited so many times that what remains is the less desirable cuts, the pieces you were saving because they required more effort to make palatable, the bottom of the barrel reality that the phrase bottom of the barrel was literally invented to describe. The hay for the animals is in its final third, because you have been calculating it all winter that you have enough. Probably, if nothing unexpected happens, if the cold breaks on schedule, if the cow stays healthy, the word probably is doing a great deal of work in your life right now. This final stretch of winter had a name in the folk calendars of medieval Europe, the Hungry Gap, or variations on that phrase in different languages, and the name was not metaphorical. It described a real phenomenon, the period between when stored autumn food supplies ran critically low and when the first spring foods became available, a gap that could last anywhere from a few weeks to a couple of months depending on the severity of the winter and the adequacy of the harvest. And that was responsible for a significant proportion of the malnutrition and starvation mortality that medieval populations experienced. The Hungry Gap was not a failure of planning or a consequence of laziness. It was a structural feature of the agricultural calendar in a world without refrigeration, global food trade, or any mechanism for moving surplus food from regions of plenty to regions of shortage with anything approaching speed or reliability. The psychological texture of February and early March in a medieval community was shaped by this arithmetic in ways that permeated every interaction and every decision. Food sharing, which had been relatively generous in November and December when stores were full and confidence was high, became more careful now. The hospitality extended to travelers and the portions given to feast day gatherings were recalibrated against the reality of what remained. This was not meanness. It was survival mathematics performed in real time, and everyone in the community understood it and performed their own version of it simultaneously, which created a collective mood of watchful conservation that was the emotional signature of late winter in the medieval world. The body registered the hungry gap before the mind fully acknowledged it. Medieval winter bodies arriving at February were carrying less subcutaneous fat than they had entered winter with. Months of slightly insufficient caloric intake had drawn down the reserves accumulated through the relative abundance of autumn. Muscles that had been rested through the quieter winter months were softer than they would be in summer, but they were also depleted in ways that would take weeks of better eating to restore. The specific nutritional deficiencies of a winter diet built on salt meat, dried legumes, and stored grain were now at their most acute. Vitamin C, absent from a diet without fresh fruits or vegetables for months, produced the early symptoms of scurvy in the most vulnerable: bleeding gums, slow healing wounds, the particular fatigue that goes beyond tiredness into something that feels like the body doubting its own continuation. Medieval people did not know about vitamin C. They knew about the spring greens that cured these symptoms, and they watched for them with an urgency that was as much medical as culinary. Those first spring greens, the nettles pushing through snow at the field's edge, the hawthorn leaves barely unfurling on bare branches, the watercress in the cold stream, the wild garlic whose smell arrived before its leaves were fully visible, were consumed with an enthusiasm that modern foragers trying to recreate medieval diet find difficult to fully understand until they have actually spent a winter eating from stored supplies. The bitterness of early spring greens, which modern palates often find challenging, was experienced by the medieval winter body as something close to a craving satisfied, because the specific phytochemicals and vitamins in those bitter leaves were precisely what months of winter diet had failed to provide. The body knew what it needed in the way that bodies know things, below the level of conscious nutritional analysis, and it directed desire accordingly. The animals shared the hungry gap in their own way. By February, livestock that had been brought through winter on stored hay and grain were visibly diminished, ribby, rough-coated, moving with the careful energy conservation of creatures running on reduced fuel. The hay supply was being watched as carefully as the grain supply, and the calculations were similar enough. Probably if the grass starts coming through by mid-March, if the weather turns when it should, if none of the animals develop a condition that requires extra feeding. The first appearance of new grass in the fields was a moment of genuine community celebration. Not the performative celebration of a feast day, but the spontaneous, relieved celebration of people who had been watching for something important and have finally seen it. Livestock turned out onto the first thin spring grass were observed with the particular fondness that belongs to watching something you were worried about recover, and the recovery of the animals was also the recovery of the household's future, because every animal that made it through winter was a breeding animal, a working animal, a dairy animal, a future resource standing on shaky legs in the pale March sunshine. Lent, which occupied the final weeks of winter in the Christian calendar, arriving in late February or early March and lasting 40 days until Easter, was a period of religious fasting and abstinence that coincided almost perfectly with the hungry gap, and historians have spent considerable energy debating whether this coincidence was deliberate, whether the Church, in establishing Lent's timing, was responding to the agricultural reality of late winter food scarcity by providing a theological framework for what was going to happen anyway, or whether the timing was purely theological, following the narrative of Christ's 40 days in the wilderness, and the agricultural coincidence was just that, a coincidence that turned out to be useful. The honest answer is probably that both things were true, that the Church absorbed pre-existing seasonal fasting traditions that had their roots in the practical reality of late winter scarcity, as it absorbed so many pre-existing seasonal practices, and gave them new theological meaning while preserving their original function. Whatever its origins, Lent served the hungry gap population in several practical ways. The requirement to abstain from meat-directed consumption toward fish, which in the form of stockfish and salt herring remained available when meat stores were depleted. The fasting requirements reduced overall caloric consumption in a way that extended the remaining supplies without anyone having to make the socially uncomfortable individual decision to eat less. The Church made the decision for everyone simultaneously, which distributed the reduction equitably and removed the individual anxiety of being seen to be running short. And the anticipation of Easter, the feast that ended Lent, the celebration of resurrection and renewal that was the most important event in the Christian calendar, provided a specific, dated, theologically charged moment toward which the final hungry weeks were oriented, a fixed point of anticipated abundance that made the current scarcity feel purposeful rather than merely endured. The preparations for Easter began while Lent was still in progress, and these preparations were themselves a form of psychological therapy for the late winter community. Eggs, which hens began producing again as the days lengthened, had been forbidden during Lent and had been accumulating, collected and preserved in various ways, throughout the fasting period. The preparation of Easter foods, the cleaning of the house that spring cleaning traditions derive from, the making of new clothes where resources allowed, the social organization of the Easter feast, all of this gave February and early March a purposeful forward orientation that countered the psychological drag of the hungry gap. You were not merely enduring the end of winter. You were building towards something. The distinction matters more than it sounds. The lengthening days were the most reliable signal that winter was actually ending, more reliable than temperature, which could spike brutally cold well into March, more reliable than the calendar, which was a human construction laid over a natural process that did not always cooperate with the dates assigned to it. Light was the honest indicator. The fact that you could see the far end of the field in the late afternoon when a month ago you could not. The fact that the morning darkness lifted noticeably earlier each week. The fact that birds were beginning to return. That the particular quality of the birdsong in the bare hedgerows was changing from the thin winter repertoire to something richer and more varied. These were the signals that medieval people read with the same attention and relief that they had read the signals of winter's arrival in October, and they were reading them now in the other direction, each one a confirmation that the season was genuinely turning. The social mood of the community shifted in ways that were both subtle and profound as the signs accumulated. The inward orientation of deep winter, the drawing together around the fire, the lowered voices, the conservation of energy in every sense, began to relax and open outward. People spent more time outside, not because the temperature required it, but because the light invited it, because the human nervous system responds to lengthening days with a biological lift in mood and energy that is as real as any seasonal depression running in the opposite direction in autumn. Medieval people did not have a scientific explanation for why they felt better in March than in January. They had the experience of feeling better, and they trusted it, and they planned around it, and the agricultural calendar that sent them back to the fields in spring was calibrated to this biological reality as much as to the meteorological one. The plowing that began in late winter and early spring. Plow Monday, the first Monday after Twelfth Night, traditionally marked the ceremonial return to agricultural work, though actual plowing waited for ground conditions, represented the transition from winter's passive endurance to spring's active engagement that was one of the great psychological turning points of the medieval year. To put a plow into the earth after months of cold and confinement was to reassert the fundamental human relationship with the land that winter had suspended, to begin again the cycle of cultivation and harvest whose continuity was the foundation of everything. Medieval plowing ceremonies were serious community events, with the plow itself decorated, blessings sought from the church, and the whole community gathered to witness the first furrow as a collective statement of intent and hope. You have made it, not easily, not without cost, not without the specific diminishment that months of cold and limited food and long darkness produce in a body and a community. But you have made it, and the evidence is everywhere around you. In the thinning snow at the field's edge, in the sound of meltwater running in the ditch, in the smell of turned earth that is one of the most ancient and consoling smells available to human nostrils, in the way the light falls differently today than it did a month ago, longer and slightly warmer and unmistakably, blessedly changed. And now the pace of this telling slows, the way the season itself slows when it finally turns. Not rushing toward spring but easing into it, the way cold water eases toward warmth, degree by imperceptible degree. You set down what you have been carrying. The constant calculation, the watchfulness, the managed anxiety of a household running its arithmetic against the season. You put it down for a moment because the worst is behind you, and the body knows this before the mind catches up, and it responds with a loosening that is almost physical, a long unclenching of something that has been held tight since October. The fire still burns tonight because the nights are still cold, but it burns differently now. Less urgently, less desperately, more like company than necessity. You sit with it for a while in the lengthening evening, which is not as long as a summer evening yet, but is noticeably, measurably, promisingly longer than it was last week. The house is quiet around you. The animals breathe their slow, warm breath. The pottage pot sits at the fire's edge, still doing what it has done all winter, still warm, still there, the most reliable object in your world. Outside, under a sky that holds just a little more light than it held last night, the village is settling into sleep. Every hearth is banked, every door shut, every household wrapped in the particular piece of a winter that has been survived rather than merely endured. The stories that have been told this winter, the long evenings of spinning and singing and the careful rationing of food and warmth and hope, all of it settles now into the accumulated memory of the community. Another winter added to all the winters before it. Another proof of what ordinary human beings can do when they do it together. You breathe. The smoke and the wool and the earth smell of your house fills your lungs, and it is warm, and you are here, and the light is coming back. Sleep comes slowly, gently, the way spring comes. Not all at once, but persistently, insistently, with the patient certainty of something that knows it will arrive. The first sleep takes you softly, and somewhere in the quiet hours between first sleep and second, you surface briefly into the warm dark of your house. Hear the fire still ticking in its banked embers, feel the weight of the blankets and skins above you, and understand, in the wordless way that the body understands things, that you have done it again. Another winter, another spring waiting just beyond the last of the cold. You close your eyes, and the second sleep is deeper than the first, and longer and very, very still. Let the season turn. Let the light come back. You have earned it. Every degree of warmth, every green shoot pushing through the last of the frost, every morning that arrives a little sooner than the one before. Rest now. The fields will wait. The work will come. But tonight, in this warm and smoky and animal breathing and firelit dark, there is nothing required of you but this, to breathe and to let go, and to sleep as the medieval world sleeps at the end of winter, quietly, gratefully, wrapped in everything that kept you here.